I guess we don't have the public comments on the agenda, but do we have?
There's white cards out there for an actual agenda.
Okay, so there are white cards to speak to an actual agenda item. As a reminder, those must be submitted to the board secretary, Ms. Hilda Juarez, and I think everyone within the sound of my voice has heard this a few times. So, but that we can allow people to speak up to 5 minutes, and it may be shorter if we get a sudden flock of people. So with that, thank you everyone for being here. Welcome. And if we're doing a roll call, let it show that Ms. Jeannie Simons, Ms. Tiffany Arenas, and Matt Jewett are here, as are both members of cabinet. And we can, and Ms. Hilda Juarez, and several people in the audience. And
texting Annette.
yes, and we are expecting Ms. Annette Sexton-Ruiz probably later, and Mr. Zaragoza will not be here, unfortunately. So with that, we can roll right into talking about money.
Well, isn't that an exciting thing to open the day with?
Yeah.
Because my part of the discussion regarding budget is first, Scott has asked me to start by saying that we're going to talk a little bit about the outlook for federal budgets. We're going to talk more about the outlook for state budget because more information is currently available. And then Scott's going to spend some time just going briefly over the governor's budget. So with that, I will begin. And I'm sure that Tiffany has shared with the board and cabinet information that she gained when she was at the FRN here recently regarding all of the shenanigans, or whatever you want to call it, that are occurring in Washington, having to do with the projections for federal funding going forward. What I can say about that is we'll talk today about a little bit about the sequester and the continuing resolution and how action or inaction on either one of those two issues will affect our federal funding for next year. Okay. I can tell you, and it's very important to note that because there is so much instability around what's going to happen with the federal budget, that we really are having problems trying to determine how to forecast money, and it makes it very difficult for us to make programmatic and staffing decisions as we go forward. And that is just a fact of life. As I mentioned, I'll go over a little bit about the sequester and a little bit about the continuing resolution. As I'm sure that all of you are aware,
Could you skip them?
yeah, I think I did. Yeah, that's okay, thank you. I thought I was going to talk about sequester first, thank you. The sequester is scheduled to take effect on March 1st. Current information coming out of Washington, and it wholly depends on who is giving the information, the percentage of reduction. We're hearing anything from about 5.1 to 8.2. I'm kind of guessing it's going to be closer to between 5% and 7%. But there's no way to know that because they can't arrive at a decision just yet. If the sequester actually takes place, it will impact, as all of you know, all federally funded anything. Everything from defense to federal programs to everything, I believe, except Medicare and Social Security. So that's going to be pretty problematic. The information that I'm getting now, and if you follow it on the news, it seems that right now it's more likely to happen than not. That could change in 5 minutes because that seems to be how they're operating today. But it's more likely to happen than not. And if they do allow the sequester to occur, it's likely that they will allow that to go on into summer in order for them to consider what they might want to do about a budget for next year. So they could let the sequester occur. They can work between, after that sequester occurs, at which time many problems will happen. But then they can work on trying to come up with a budget or deal with the issue of the continuing resolution, which is the next thing that could affect us. The continuing resolution is what our government is currently operating on as spending authority, because we have not actually had a Congress adopted budget for over 4 years, 1,300 and some odd days, so a long time. The continuing resolution expires March 27th, so it's going to expire after the date the sequester is to take effect. If the continuing resolution expires without congressional action, the government will have to shut down because it will not have authority to spend money, which means that all cash flow out of Washington will have to stop.
What is the I'm sorry. What's the likelihood of that, do you think?
You know, I cannot imagine a scenario where Congress would actually allow that to happen, because it would just cause havoc. Chaos would rapidly ensue in the country.
Politically as well.
and political.
Economically, yeah.
Politically and economically. So I am thinking that they will not let that expire. What they probably are going to do, at least what I'm hearing most, is that they will let the sequester take place, which will result in allocations for the 13-14 school year funding for education to be decreased by the amount that's in the sequester. Other funds that go out, however, will be immediately affected. It won't immediately affect education because education programs are forward funded for the most part. Other kinds of government spending are not forward funded, but education is. So it could dry up money for defense, for other kinds. They could say we are going to take back all unobligated funds, which is what they're thinking they might do.
And could they do that for us?
No.
Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say no. What I should say is that 2/3 of our federal funds for education are forward funded. 1/3 is not. The 1/3 that isn't, they could take the unobligated funds, but that's a smaller portion. Unobligated funds would fall into this category. If you have money that you have budgeted for supplies and you have not spent that money, those are unobligated funds. If, however, you have extended a contract, a teaching contract, or a contract for the superintendent or whomever else, staff member, that's considered obligated until the end of the contract. So there are two different kinds of, that's generally what it is. Excuse me. What is more likely to happen is that they will let the sequester occur. They will try to figure out what they're going to do with that continuing resolution. They may extend the continuing resolution for 6 months or so, and then come up with a budget, or they may extend it for longer than that. They've been talking about a budget for so long that people don't have confidence that it's going to happen anytime soon. I don't know, Tiffany, did you hear anything that you think is...
What some of the staff kept saying was that all the people that are coming to, most of the groups that are coming to lobby, everybody are saying, no, we're against the sequester, it's too extreme, it's too devastating to our cause. So there's definitely a lot of pushback from people down there. But there was a lot of unknowns, like you were saying. We just don't know yet.
I think that the greatest lobby against the sequester is the fence. And it is the one that has the most clout with the people who are thinking letting a sequester happen would be the way to go. So it's who knows what.
And there was I don't know if this is influencing anyone's view in Washington, but the CBO did just update some projections in the last week or so. And what they've seen is actually Medicare and Medicaid costs at healthcare, which healthcare is really one of the biggest drivers, just like it is in our district.
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest drivers of our increasing deficits, especially going forward. And Medicare and Medicaid growth have been slower in the last 2 to 3 years than was predicted. And it's something along the lines of $200 billion worth of savings just from healthcare costs slowing down. And economists don't agree on exactly why that is, but that is going forward, it's reducing the cost of the quote-unquote doctor fix, where Medicare payment rates are supposed to fall every year, and then Congress has to find a patch. So that's one of the things that works against the, I think works against the cutting of the, the sequestration, is that we've got all these other things that aren't considered on budget, but we know that at some point Congress is going to do something to fix this. So the CBO estimates actually cut in half recently the cost of fixing the doctor rates that are supposed to go down every year, but Congress always patches. And also our deficit now is, yes, now at its lowest level since 2008 as we were going into the Great Recession. And as a percentage of our nation's economy, it's about where it was in the early 1980s under President Reagan. But obviously our nation has longer term fiscal problems as more and more baby boomers retire and are not working and putting so much tax revenue in, but they're starting to hit up Medicare and Social Security. So it just seems to me, and this is more commentary, but I'd be interested if anyone has heard anything about this maybe affecting people's views on sequestration, that right now most of our deficit problems are still to come. They're kind of in the out years and later this decade and in the coming decades. And right now, if we are to make cuts in this very year, further cuts, it really doesn't reduce our overall deficit a lot, but it hurts jobs. And in poll after poll, the American public is concerned about deficits. They are 2 to 4 times more concerned about jobs in the economy. And the CBO has frequently said any further cuts you make are going to reduce job growth, keep unemployment at 8%. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. And I think we're an example of that if these cuts come down, we could have jobs on the line.
Yeah, and we would. And that, thank you for sharing that, Matt, because I've heard that mostly on some of the talking head shows, and you watch what the responses are from the Speaker of the House, who kind of summarily rejected the last proposal that the administration put forward. I think that what it's going to come down to, though, is important. You mentioned an important point, and that is the politics of the whole thing. Because we have one party who has at least part of their membership who just want to let it happen and go from there. There's increasing pressure on that element to have a change of heart. So we'll have to see if they can get to them. March 1st is coming soon, and March 22nd or 27th is coming sooner. One of the differences, however, between the sequester and the continuing resolution is that if we go to sequestration, it's an absolute across-the-board percentage reduction. If we go to a continuing resolution, there will be a reduction, but the agency heads will make the decisions about where those monies will be reduced. So for the Department of Ed, as an example, they have a large priority on their Race to the Top and some other programs that they've implemented over these last recent years. They may not want to lose any money from those, so they may be willing to lose more from some of the other entitlement type programs. Or they may just decide to take the same percentage across all grants. It's hard to say how they'll handle that. It would be important for you to know that our district currently has in federal allocations a little over $9 million, not including carryover from last year. Of that, our 4 major grants are far and away the biggest player in that. And those grants are Title I, Title II. Title I funds academic achievement. Title IIA is professional development and effective teachers and principals. Title III is our ELL money funding to support that program. And then IDEA funds programs for special education kids. The total of those you can see is over $7.5 million. All 4 of those programs are supporting, in part, the infrastructure that we have built to improve student achievement. So as we lose money from those grants, that's kind of what you're looking at.
And Pam, isn't Title I the biggest portion of that?
Yes.
Remembering it was in the 5 or 6 million.
It's $522,000. $5,222,000.
And I know over the years, at least through the 2000s, we saw big increases in Title I in this district. Although it seems like it either leveled off or maybe come down a little.
It has.
And is that because of any federal cuts that have happened to Title I, or is that because of our student population decreasing and maybe the poverty rate? I don't know how things may be affected as our demographics shift.
It's a kind of a combination of both. Well, Title I lost a little bit of money in the last couple of continuing resolutions, as all programs did. It was not real significant in the overall picture of things. Our district has lost about 4.3 or so % of its Title I money in the last 3 years, and if you go back further than that, even more, a greater percentage. Or not 4.3, but 12%, 4.3 last year. It's basically due to poverty census and the redistribution of kids who are the poverty kids calculated in the most recent census. So it's mostly poverty census. Although I was interested to see the census numbers that will affect this year's allocation. Our poverty census numbers went up about 70 kids, which was kind of a surprise to me because we lost in the regular census, but they do adjustments every year using some AFDC and other kinds of numbers, and we went up, and our increase was a little greater than increases across Maricopa County, which I found to be kind of surprising, but that's how it worked out. So that may help us because our district was, we were losing poverty census kids to some of the outlying districts. So their funds were increasing while inner city or urban districts were decreasing because of the redistribution of kids. There is a rule in Title I that says you can't take down a Title I program by more than 5% a year unless there is an accompanying loss of overall federal dollars. Then you can take it down a little bit more. So,
And just for background information, you might want to share the difference between poverty census and our free and reduced lunch rate, because mostly when we talk about poverty, people typically hear free and reduced lunch rate, and poverty census is different. You may want to explain that.
sure. Poverty census are the kids that were identified in the most recent national census, like our 2010 census, 2010 census. So they're the number of kids in poverty that were identified when families filled out the census forms. And that's the money that gets the allocations out to the states and then to the schools. Those are the monies that the state, both the state and the federal government used to, I think I pulled out a plug here.
Yeah, it's all out.
Is it this big? Yes, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
It was loose, I caught it on my boot. Free and reduced lunch count is the count that we use to allocate Title I funds directly to the schools. So there are two different counts of poverty, kids in poverty. And that is, those numbers are generated by the number of kids whose families have filled out free and reduced lunch applications. Right now, our free and reduced lunch participation ranges from a low at Squaw Peak of 51%, and it's been a little lower than that a couple of times, to a high of 99% at several schools. Creighton, Gateway, a couple of them. And we are, it's important to note that you're required by law to allocate funds to schools based on some poverty indicator we use free and reduced lunch count. I also want to note that any change in the areas that affect our staff who are supported by M&O funds will also affect federally funded staff. So if, for instance, I am partially funded out of Title I. If there's a salary increase, this positions would have to take that increase out of Title I. Also, any change in benefits like Arizona State retirement computations or the cost of insurance going up and down apply to federally funded staff as
You
well.
lost the slide, if you could back. What?
Okay, sorry about that, thanks. So, back to the percentage of decrease. For those 4 programs that I mentioned, Title I, Title II, Title III, and IDEA, this would be the amount that we would lose if it took those percentages. So a 5% decrease would be about $380,000. An 8.2% increase would be $625,000. That's a significant cut out of those grants. Most of it is likely to come out of Title I and IDEA.
And isn't IDEA, Pam, I know I've heard when I was in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, I was working on Capitol Hill when Jim Jeffords, senator from Vermont, switched from being a Republican to an independent and caucused with the Dems and put the Dems in charge of the Senate. And one of the things that was his last-ditch effort to stay in the Republican Party was he was going to stay if the Republicans consented to increases in, I think it was IDEA, because this was passed sometime, IDEA was passed like in 74 or something.
Yeah.
And it basically, the promise, my understanding is the promise was there that the feds were going to pick up a certain percentage, like half of the cost or 40% of the cost of educating students with disabilities, and that in reality at that point it was like they had picked up something like 18% of the cost, and he really wanted to get it closer. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, we face cuts to IDEA, but does this really cover how much of the costs of what we have to do under IDEA does the funding really cover?
That would take a bit of a study, and Scott may be able to speak to that. I can tell you that it does not cover the cost of implementing all of the requirements that are contained in IDEA. We do not receive adequate dollars to cover the difference between the cost of M&O and the cost of implementing all of those requirements.
Pam, if we could back up for a second, I'm kind of curious about the statement that it would be hit in IDEA, because my experience, and as we've watched a lot of other cuts, we've seen IDEA kind of hanging on, and you've heard me say they have a tremendous lobby, and I'm just wondering what.
How I came to that?
Yeah, how you going?
When we got some information from ASBO, I believe that they were projecting that IDEA would be cut 7 point some percent. I don't have that 7 point some percent. Do you remember I gave you we looked at a table that had those percentage reductions, and IDEA was very high. I was very surprised at how high
Yeah,
it was.
that's unusual because
It is
they tend to
unusual.
hang on, even when we've been decreasing in other areas, we end up with a few $1,000s more.
Right.
So,
As a matter of fact, last year, most grants took a reduction. IDEA, we had a little bit of an increase, not a substantial one. It was negligible. But when we got those figures, the percentages that were broken down by grant, IDEA was 7.1 or 2. I don't remember. It was big. I was very surprised at that. So as you can see, the reductions would be substantial. I am not thinking it's going to be any less than 5%, and it could be more. And we did already look at the impact of federal funds based on changes of salary, etc. I think that it's really important, and I am concerned about this, and I know that everyone else is as well, that if we don't get our federal allocations until mid to late summer, we're going to have to let contracts based on best guess. Unless the Congress does something before that, it really poses difficulty in planning. And it causes a lot of staff uncertainty, because if people are thinking we're going to have to take $600,000 out of a grant and out of our grants, and the majority of our grants are focused on salaries. We don't have a lot of fluff in our grants. We're really targeting that money. It's going to be an uncertain time, and people are going to be uncomfortable with that uncertainty.
So is this regular, just teachers, certified, classified staff, or is this things like instructional coaches and
I think yes.
Title I facilitators and
Yes.
things like that?
Yes, for Title I.
Right.
Title I would be, all of our reading interventionists are Title I funded, except there are some that are SPED teachers that are doing reading interventionists, but our reading interventionists are Title I funded. Our instructional coaches, our student achievement teachers, our parent liaisons are Title I funded, jointly Title I and Title III. People like my position is partially funded out of Title I. There are a variety of other salaries, some instructional aides that the schools have, although we don't have too many of those. Most of them are funded out of Title I. A good part of our technological infrastructure is funded out of grants. All of the help desk salaries, all 4 of those are funded out of Title I. One of our network admins, who is part-time admin and part-time trainer, is funded out of grants. Our technology peer coach is funded out of grants. We have a portion of a number of positions in IDEA, folks like psychologists. A portion of their salary is paid from IDEA because we can joint pay those. Our nurses.
I'm sorry, our nurses are, or?
Part. Yes. I think a 0.35. Many of our one-on-one aides are funded out of IDEA.
So a lot of these people who are funded out of federal funds, especially when we're talking about instructional coaches and SATs, seems like it's been the people who have been really, really integral to what we've had going on with WestEd the last few years. And we're now losing that funding from the Ellis Center. So I can see how you guys are,
We're having.
I don't know if deer in headlights is the right word, but yeah, exactly.
You know what's important is that as we look at the funding from the Ellis Center, the funding from the Ellis Center is really funding the support we get from WestEd. The funding from the Ellis Center is not funding any of the
Correct.
district employees.
Yeah.
Some of their partially or.
Is it okay for me? I didn't want to interrupt you, Shari. Jim asked me to mention some other folks. Our Director of Language Services, our Program Director, Nora, for our ELL services is funded out of Title III. Miriam, who is our literacy person, is currently funded out of Title I. And then the position that Sylvia holds is a combination career ladder, and that money is also going away. She's partially funded out of there. So we have a lot of our, there's our infrastructure and our support to the schools that's enabled them to do the things they need to do is almost wholly funded by grants. Almost wholly funded by grants.
Just curious, so is things like Rosetta Stone, does that money also, are there programs, I mean, you're talking a lot about salaries, I'm just curious,
We did buy Rosetta Stone with grant money. We have funded Study Island, and a lot of our supplemental curriculum that we're using in our intervention programs were funded with grants. We cannot fund adopted curriculum with grant money because that's the responsibility of the school district, but supplemental types of supports we can and do. Other questions about that?
Just to expand on that a little bit, a lot of our student intervention programs and materials have been funded out of either IDEA or
Title I.
Title I.
It's like the reading programs that they have for Tier 2 and Tier 3.
Yes,
Correct.
yes,
Correct.
yes.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, it would be important to note here, you will probably remember that a few years back, Congress authorized some stimulus money and some went to the schools. We used a great deal of our stimulus money for Title I to buy up front and pay for 3 years out. Programs like Study Island, we bought computers for our SPED teachers out of IDEA stimulus. So when we used that money, we tried to use it in ways that we were not going to need to replicate that expense year after year after year, so we could fund out front. So yes. Other questions about?
And just to clarify, classroom teachers aren't maintenance and operations.
Yes, and that is important to note. Because we are required to have classroom teachers for our children, it is a state requirement. We cannot use federal funds to pay for classroom teachers.
And that's, to just kind of give you a framework, if it's required by the state,
Yes.
right, then we can't use federal dollars for it. So one of the interesting things that happens is with our English language learners.
Mm-hmm.
Our program, our 4-hour program is a requirement of the state,
Right.
which prevents us from using our reading intervention as funded out of Title I to provide support to those children, which sounds insane, but that's how the rule works.
Wait, even if they qualify, even if we test them and do the pre-test to see
Outside of the 4 hours, we can provide intervention.
Okay.
Anytime during that 4 hours where it's state mandated, we cannot provide intervention. So we could not, for example, take a reading intervention, push into a reading, EL reading classroom during that time. Now, after the 4 hours of services, then if there's any time left in the day, then
which means that they would be pulled once more from social studies or science.
And that's a
Right.
problematic thing.
so but that's the general, and that'll give you the general rule. If it's required by the state and something the state is to fund, then we cannot use federal dollars.
And if we found ourselves in the situation that we were doing that, it would be supplanting, and we would have to pay those funds back. It
What-
is just not allowable, sorry.
No, go ahead. What about with full day kindergarten, before it was funded under, when Governor Napolitano pushed for funding of that, did we fund that under Title I or some federal?
You know, no, we did have a state full-day kindergarten program
Oh, that's
in this district for a while before they disbanded that program, and it's no longer authorized. Some school districts are using some of their Title I funds to fund full-day kindergarten, but it would take a big chunk of money, and you could not fund full-day kindergarten in some schools and pay for it in other schools with M&O. It would have to be all Title I or all M&O.
And would, I can't remember, Pam, did they have to, when they did that, because it was state funded, did they have to wait a year and fund it out of M&O before they could go and use their Title I's for that funding?
In this particular case, because the state legislature did determine to eliminate funding for half-day K, they allowed districts to go ahead that very year and fund it with Title I money, but you had to show that your board looked for M&O funds, determined that there were none, and determined that instead we will look for outside sources. If you were unable to do that, as some districts were, then you could not. You needed to show that you had no M&O funds to pick it up. It's kind of the business of how you work federal money and even some state money, which also has supplanting, non-supplanting clauses, together to get to the place you want to get. You have to really think through that very carefully, or you find yourself in very murky waters.
Paying money back.
Paying money back. And when you pay it back, you don't pay it back out of the federal grant, you pay it back out of M&O, which is why you want to always be very conscious about making those kinds of decisions. And that's the end of my part of the presentation, and I'd be happy to take any more questions if you have any. I wish I had better news, but I don't think anybody does about the federal budget right now. Maybe they will all decide that they want to play well with one another, and they'll get this done in the interest of our country, I would hope so.
I'm going to lie too long to think that.
Thank you very much.
Mr. President, members of the board, good morning. So we'll switch now and focus on the sort of the state budget, how it impacts Creighton, but even more so the changes that Creighton specifically is looking at for the 13-14 budget. So we start with good news this year. This is the first time for me, but we're actually up in student count. Although at the same time, we're special ed and ELL seem to be down a little bit. So my traditionally I would take a student and weight them at about 1 1/3, because not all students are funded the same way. And 1 1/3 had always been very reliable to do a forecast. This year, with some of those other counts being down, that 94 students will provide us about $200,000 additional funding. At least it won't be less than that. It could, depending on how our reconciliation shakes out, maybe closer to 3, but as for now, I'm using 200,000 in it, and that's a kind of a worst case scenario. Health insurance, our health insurance committee met last night and reached consensus, and we do expect to save some money on health insurance for next year.
As in less cost next year than this year?
Less cost next year than this year.
On health insurance? Well, yeah.
It's a different structure. It's not going to be what we're used to, but it is still a policy that most districts cannot afford. We are going to recommend a program that is there are districts opting out of programs that are not as good as what we have because they can no longer afford them. So it's, you know, it depends on your perspective, but yeah, we're gonna realize the savings for that for this next year.
Well, I'll ask this, is that from the, yeah, no, you don't have to, in case Scott doesn't know. Ask Scott, is that from the, are you at liberty to say who that is, who the insurer is? I'm just wondering if that's from the trust, or from the, whatever, the ASBA.
ASBATE. We had a proposal from ASBATE.
Could you clarify what that is?
ASBATE is a consortium of school districts that combined their pool and went out and did their own bid. They also have a third-party administrator to actually run the program, and they use Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance, so it's kind of a pass-through.
So are they self-insured then?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Walber, before you answer Mr.
Sorry.
Green's question, I don't know what the protocol is for notifying the vendors and how that gets out and the public nature of that. So
That's a good point.
Yeah, I would suggest that
This
maybe
is-
we be careful around.
That's why I was wondering. That's what I was going to ask Shar. Without going up there. But that's probably a good idea, Dr. Bogner. If we can talk privately about it later, that would be good. If I'm allowed to, maybe I'm not even allowed to.
Well,
But anyway,
I can continue to explain what ASBATE is if you'd like me to.
Yeah,
That's
good.
just,
Okay.
that's just a company or a consortium.
which may or may not have been the best bidder.
Yeah.
We'll find that out later.
Madison, Isaac, Cartwright, Osborne are among the bigger districts around here who are members. They've been around for quite a while, and well, they have a number of programs that they submit to school districts. Their board is entirely school people, superintendents and such.
And they only deal with the healthcare issue, or were they a consortium for other school district issues?
I believe they're only healthcare, but there are other consortiums, like our liability insurance is a very similar organization. The trust, that's school districts, and I believe they might have some, water districts and organizations like that, but it's primarily school districts. Our workers' comp is through a similar kind of a arrangement.
Is our workers' comp through the?
It's an offshoot of the trust.
Okay.
It's called the Alliance.
So it's not the state. What's the big one that used to be the state agency?
SCF.
CF. Yeah.
So we left them this year. This is year one with the
Okay.
trust.
Secret agency names and.
You would think that after all this time I would have all these government acronyms down, but it's been a long week.
There's just too many.
Yeah.
Just too many. Okay, classroom site funds, Prop 301, funded by a 0.6% sales tax. Recently, you saw in the paper there was some found money, and every district had a share. Some had been overpaid, most had been underpaid. Creighton's figure was an underpayment of $400,000. So at that point, those funds are budget controlled just like M&O is. So, for example, we could spend our entire M&O budget on the first day, assuming the bank would honor all those checks. But we're under no constraint to wait until money comes in. Our legal budget is our legal budget, so if we have more cash than that, we can't spend it, because the budget represents authority to spend. And so cash and budget are two different things. So as that news came out in the paper, my first concern was that everyone would think we suddenly had $400,000 and we could do whatever we wanted with it. And it was not until a couple of days later that I got to sit in my office for half a day, go back and recalculate our budget capacity since the inception of the program, and I did arrive at the conclusion that we can spend that money. So that's $400,000, and that goes 40% of that will fund our teacher pay for performance program. So for purposes of this slideshow, we subtract that out because that's dedicated, that's where that will go, that'll be paid out next November. So that leaves $240,000, but you have to keep in mind that that's one time, right? That's not coming in again, that's cash that's there now, so there's a number of ways to look at that. Separate from that, the economy has improved a little bit, our payments are a little higher, and we now have some carry forward, and so I believe we can spend an additional $100,000 of those funds on a permanent basis. That remaining $240,000 will all go one way or another into the teacher's salary schedule because it has a no supplant clause, just like Title I does. So it has to supplement M&O and not supplant it. So what that means really is that that money can only be used for teacher pay increases.
Although I'm sure that would be appreciated by our teachers.
So here are the all the things with negative impact that we know of for next year's budget. So negative doesn't mean bad, it just means additional cost. Our staffing projections are in, and we see the need for 10 new teachers. Those are classrooms that currently are at or above the maximum that we want them to be at. So that'll require 10 teachers next year to help with that. We have 3 days of professional development on our salary schedules that had been funded by Indian Gaming monies, also known as instructional improvement. Those monies had some there's a limited basket of uses for that. This was one, but we have been using that in excess of revenues for the last 2 or 3 years, and that money is now gone, so that needs to move over to M&O. And thus represents a budget reduction. When full-day kindergarten was no longer funded by the state, when they canceled that program, many districts had overrides in place, and that figures into that calculation because your override is 10% of the revenue control limit, which included full-day kindergarten funding. So when they canceled that program, they enacted a provision that allowed us to continue to calculate our override as though that were still in place. That phases out this year. I have been told, I've not seen it in writing, that it has showed up on some legislators at least list of things they might bring forward, so we might get relief on that. We're not sure yet, but at this point that expires this year.
And again, if the legislature were to offer relief on that again, it doesn't cost the state any money, right? It would cost the local taxpayers, because what it does is it allows us to have a little bit bigger, take in a little bit more from our override, right?
That's correct. The override's funded entirely by our local property taxpayers, so that on one hand makes it easier for the state to pass because it doesn't cost them anything to do so, similar to the debt ceiling issue on the bond side. We used an Azella testing team this year. We had reduced that from the budget a few years ago, but the rules changed a little bit this year and we had to do that. So if that continues, that would be a $60,000 expenditure that we did not have in the past. The ASRS contribution rate has been calculated, and so that one's a certainty, and that's $90,000.
How does that increase, Scott, with an ASRS compare with previous years? Do you know what percentage point that is?
It's kind of been all over the place. It seems like that's one of the lower ones. I remember 2 years ago it was only $12,000.
Wow.
That was the lowest, and it has been higher than that in other years. And that's projected to continue to increase for the next several years.
If I could just back up for a second to give the board some additional information on the Azella testing team. The test this year took longer. That's what it really came down to. We even had to install additional phones because a portion of the test has to be done by phone and students have to talk into the phone. So it took longer, and that was all part of it. But this is another one of those areas, and Pam and I deal with this yearly. Another one of those areas where the Azella test is a state mandated test, and we have people at each site who are you would think might be able to help give this test, but because they're funded out of federal funds, they can't give the test. So that's why we had to bring back the Azella testing team. And those are typically retired staff who come back and help with that.
So that's 1.1 million to the negative side. So to summarize all of that, add our enrollment growth and those insurance savings onto those minuses, we come out with a deficit before we begin to address any kind of pay situation at a minus $400,000. So on my next slide, I'm going to lay out sort of what it would look like if we tried to give a pay increase. So this is all hypothetical, right? These figures are just calculated in here to give us a discussion starter, so to speak. So if I bring that $400,000 to the negative forward and assume that we were going to give a 2% pay increase, that would cost M&O $475,000.
And so, Scott, this would be in addition to the one-time from the underpayment of the Prop 301. I mean, would teachers get, I'm trying to wrap my head around what that money would be, like how much would teachers actually get out of that 100,000, I think you said, or 240,000, I can't remember, for the one-time.
Well, we take the 40% off, so that leaves 240, and well, we have a decision to make. I mean, you could do a lot of things. You could just pay it out as a sort of bonus if you wanted to. You could from the accountant side, what my recommendation would be is you divide that up maybe into thirds and use whatever a third is to calculate a current year increase so that you know you're sustainable for at least 3 years. Hopefully the economy has picked up by then and it becomes sustainable. So it's kind of a rainy day sort of outlook. Makes sense?
Take us through the actual slide, because you think that explains those two.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, gotcha, I see what that is.
Hopefully. So if a 2% pay increase costs $475,000 and classroom site fund can be used for the teacher portion of that, or at least the beginnings of it, you have the $100,000 that I mentioned before that has just come from increasing enrollment and revenue from the sales tax. So if I took a portion of that 240 then, for purposes of this slide, I'm saying $75,000. So that's what, 3.5 years of certain sustainability. That figure, of course, is debatable. That would leave $300,000 to come up with from the M&O side, just by subtraction from the 475. I add that to the deficit that we're already looking at, and that would make our sort of gross budget reduction for next year of $700,000 in order to make that happen. Is that clear? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
That's me.
Not to you.
I'm really confused.
And Mr. Walmer, of that, the other 2/3 of that $240,000, that stays in the fund for teacher salaries, correct?
Yes.
To be used in the future for teacher salaries.
Yes, yes.
Could I just say something to add a little bit of context to this? Yesterday I was at a superintendent's meeting of Greater Phoenix Education Management Council. There were probably over 30 superintendents there. And we conversed, and people from the legislature were there, and the Arizona Department was there. So there was a lot of whining going on, because that's what superintendents do when they get together, especially in this economy. And really all of the superintendents were talking, I mean, everybody's in the same boat. And for example, in Cave Creek, they did a survey of staff, and over 62% of teaching staff in Cave Creek have a second job. And so there are, across this state, teachers who have not had a raise in 5 years. And the superintendents are really concerned about this because teachers are very depressed about that. And for example, here's another thing that's happened because this was part of the conversation, full-day kindergarten. There are districts who could not salvage enough funds to continue with full-day kindergarten. Two things happened. Number one is they lost enrollment because families who saw the possibility of full-day kindergarten in the district next to where they lived not only took their kinders and enrolled them in the different district, but took the rest of the kids in the family. For 2 years, that's been happening. Looking at student academic achievement in those districts, not only now have they increased enrollment, but now they have students who are going into first and second grade who have very depressed literacy and problem solving skills. They're faced now with move on when reading, which is another whole issue in those districts. So we've had some very, very downhearted superintendents who can't, we're expressing themselves to the legislator, who also was very depressed because they're working with new legislators and trying to explain Common Core to them. And so everybody was kind of like in a super depressed mood. It happened to be held at Dysart in Surprise. I had to drive there for an hour. For a moment, I thought I was on my way to Disneyland until I got there, and everybody was really depressed. So I wasn't at Disneyland. But just a context to this is that there are teachers in Arizona, and here's another issue. Kindergarten, in those districts where they've now gone to morning kindergarten and afternoon kindergarten, in order to teach kindergarten, you have to have early childhood certification. Those teachers who have that no longer want to teach in kindergarten because now they've lengthened the day for kindergarten to rather than a 5-hour day, 2.5, to a 6-hour day because now they want those kinders to get at least 3 hours. So now you have kids coming in the morning, you have kids coming in the afternoon, and those teachers have chosen to maybe teach first grade, second grade, third grade, which now leaves the district in a dilemma that they can't find early childhood certified teachers to teach those kindergartens. So now they're going with long-term subs. Wow. And so it's really, we have to be so careful on the decisions that we make because they have long-term consequences for our families. So,
and I didn't hear you had said something about the districts that did reduce.
These are districts that
those
chose 2 years ago
to get rid of it. What happened to their enrollment?
Decreased, and their academic performance decreased, and their teachers left kinder to teach other areas, and now we have substitutes in those in kinder.
And I thought you said yesterday many of those students actually when they went to other districts.
Yeah, and including their older brothers and sisters. Yeah. So we really, have people who made that decision who have some unintended consequences several years later. So with that, I'll refer back to that.
Finance director's lying when they get together too.
Oh, I imagine.
Yeah.
So with your permission, I'd like to kind of go back through the classroom site fund stuff again. I understand how confusing that is, and just try to get everyone on the same page. So this cost of this 2% pay increase, two of these lines here, CSF sustainable and CSF one-time, reference back a couple of slides to here. So the classroom site funds are segregated funds. They're kept in a different fund. They roll forward. Unexpended monies roll forward. They never commingle. Of those funds, 40% go to teacher pay for performance, so they're not really part of this conversation. So on one hand, we've received this $400,000, or we're going to, and if I take that 40% off that we're going to spend on teacher pay for performance, that $400,000 becomes $240,000. On a separate hand, we have about $100,000 that we can spend because of the rising tide of sales tax revenues and carry forward from this year. Okay, so when we go to the next slide where I'm using this all in a calculation of a 2% pay increase, the $75,000 that I have on there comes from the 240. Meaning that $75,000 would be spent over 3.5 years, roughly.
And again, you stated before you started, this is hypothetical.
Yeah, that whole slide is hypothetical. So here, of the 475, the cost of a 2% pay increase, 100,000 would dollar for dollar come from increased revenues. 75,000 is roughly a third of the 240. 300,000 would come from M&O, and that equals a $475,000 cost of a 2% pay increase, district-wide. And on the federal side, each grant would, as Pam pointed out, would cover its own share of that. Okay. So in order to do that, we would have to reduce our M&O budget by $700,000. Okay. This represents feedback we got from our community council meeting a few weeks ago. We did ask them for feedback, and the form of the question is at the top. And I recorded those things that were mentioned by more than one table, that were prioritized by more than one table. So the list is longer, and that's available on a different page, but these were the things mentioned most often. So the first slide, what current programs and services are critical to accelerating student achievement, and this is what they said.
Could I make another comment, please? We met with Community Council in early November, and then several weeks later we met with a parent group that came from all the sites. So we had the combination of the two pieces of input, and then in January we met for a second time with Community Council, and we took all of the information from the previous two meetings, and they then took that information and as site groups, they went back and looked at all the data from the first two meetings, and this was the kind of a final recommendation. And so we had site groups, and we also have, and in those site groups we had additional parents, so we had staff parents.
I have a question that, again, I was going to ask Dr. Boyle, but I'll ask here, and I think you're able to divulge this one. There's been a lot of talk recently about SROs, and I was at a presentation at Children's Action Alliance. Our Juvenile Justice Committee met this week and had a discussion about that. There are a lot of different, I hadn't really realized there are a lot of different ways that SROs in this state are funded. And I know that we had Dr. Ken Scribner from Phoenix Union there. He said that theirs are funded from, I think, ADE plus some M&O. And I didn't know, are ours funded all through ADE? Is there any M&O in the SRO program?
Ours are all funded, I believe, from state funds.
From the school safety grant.
Okay, thank you.
From the school safety.
And that's a competitive grant that we had to apply for?
Yes, it is a competitive grant. We are in our second year of a 3-year competition. 5 of our schools have officers, and the remaining do not.
And the school safety grant, is that through ADE?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is. It's a legislative appropriation that is given to ADE to administer for the school safety.
Thank you. I'm so glad that everyone's here who can answer every single question I have this morning. It's really nice.
Conversely, part 2 of that feedback, what programs and services does Creighton District lack that would improve educational opportunities for students? Here again are the line items that were mentioned by more than one table.
And if I could just clarify those questions. At the time that we asked, we were coming up with this feedback protocol. We actually had some hope that we weren't going to be, at least on the M&O side, having to cut budget. We were hoping to break even possibly, based on the information we had at that time. And because of the fact that we have been in a 5-year process of reducing the budget, we felt as though we need to start looking towards not just this constant mental state of reduction, but what do we need to do to become the school district that we want to be. And so that really precipitated the way we asked the questions of these groups, because we want to start, in spite of the fact that we know that you just presented the budget situation, we want to have to start thinking in terms of how do we build the district that we want. So that was why the questions are stated the way they are.
That also explains to some extent why we're a little bit behind our normal schedule of having this wrapped up, is because we didn't know if we were going to have to subject everyone to a round of what are we going to reduce our budget to. So as long as it looked like we might not have to do that, we waited a little bit to see what might shake out.
So, go ahead.
I thought it was interesting, though, as we pulled all of the information together, that the parents, and this also had staff input and administrative input, that parents, the groups that gave input still value full-day kindergarten, still value that whole parent component of academic parent-teacher teams, realize the importance of extended activities for their students, such as junior ambassadors, instrumental and vocal music, and those extension activities. So that was important information for the governing board, and certainly important information for us. And then those additional services. And then, of course, as you look at the resources that are lacking, these are things that certainly were part of our cuts in the last 3 to 5 years. And this, again, gives us additional information on those resources that aren't currently in place, and were we to have extended funding, then we really need to look in this direction.
So here's a number of sort of miscellaneous things that we have to look at for next year and beyond. Our enrollment finally has turned upward this year. If you look at the wavelength over the past 10 years or so, it's not sort of a jagged up and down thing, but it has a longer wavelength. So there's at least some reason to believe that we may continue that and have 100 or so new kids next year as well. Good thing. The Affordable Care Act, a year and a half from now, a provision comes online that requires organizations to provide the same level of health insurance for employees who work 30 hours and up on a regular basis. We currently have just over 100 people who would fall into that category, and at $5,000 or so per policy, that's a big deal. That's kind of an elephant in the room.
So I'm sorry, so that's people who we currently have that are over 30 hours a week, but that we do not offer health insurance
Correct. That's correct.
to? Can you give me an example of who those might be?
A lot of the classroom aides. That was the biggest bunch. There's what else might we have? That might be, that's the lion's share.
Food service,
And it was
many
about,
of your food service workers who do not work 40 hours, crossing guards, those kind of hourly types of.
Some of those positions cobble together 2 or 3 responsibilities to get there, so you might be a crossing guard for 3 hours, you might work in the dining hall for 3 hours, and you know, maybe serve on the playground and get there that way.
And that's, okay, so that's, you said about 100 employees?
It's a neighborhood of 115, yep.
So you're looking at an increase of about 500,000, is that right? Did you say how much?
100 times 5,000, if that's 500,000, yeah.
You said we were projecting that we'd need 10 additional teachers next school year. So would that mean we'd need additional classroom aides or other positions that would fall into this category?
Not necessarily. Classroom aides are the first line for classrooms that become crowded.
Under the Affordable Care Act, my understanding is it is not a direct fine or penalty if you don't comply with that. It is that those folks who then do not have health insurance through their employer, if their employer is larger than 50 employees, which we are, if they are working over 30 hours, well, it could be a different provision, but the way the penalty works on having to give health insurance to your employees is generally that then if they don't have health insurance that's affordable from their employer, that they then can go into the health insurance marketplace or exchange, and if their income is below a certain level, they can get a subsidy. And if we have employees that are in there getting a subsidy, then we get fined based on how many of our employees, I can't remember if it's how many employees we have or how many are in there getting a subsidy. So I know that a lot of employers are actually doing the math right now as to whether or not it's cheaper to offer the health insurance or just pay the penalty fee.
Yeah.
The other thing to keep in mind is that, and this is very policy wonky, with the expansion of access that's on the table right now, if those employees go into the health insurance exchange or marketplace and get a subsidy, we can be penalized. If they go into access, we are not penalized. And so if access, this was one of the issues as the governor was wanting, before she was told by the Fed she couldn't do it, if we set the bar where you go from being in access to being in this new health insurance exchange at the federal poverty level versus 133% of the federal poverty level, you have a little bit more protection with an access expansion if that takes place, because more of our employees theoretically could get into access rather than, say I'm an employer and I don't offer health insurance to my employees. If more of them get into access as opposed to the health insurance exchange, I'm not penalized for those that go into access. So it I don't know, just various things to consider and watch out for. So we'll figure out, I know you'll be figuring out what that is. But
You're a little bit ahead of me on that.
And
we also control how many hours people can work, and there could be redesigns to some of that. That 115 is how many we have right now, and so we could raise a number to 40 hours and reduce others. I don't know, it depends on what kind of district we want to be, and we'll have to make those kinds of.
And that's exactly what a lot of employers are looking at. And another provision that I thought I remembered in the Affordable Care Act, but I'm sure we'll hear about it if it comes into being, is I thought that your health insurance policy had to be the same across all your employees, because I know currently we do pay for family coverage for administrators, but not for our teachers and other staff. And I thought that there was something in the Affordable Care Act that might make that not be allowed anymore.
It has to be non-discriminatory.
Okay.
And the word non-discriminatory has not yet been clearly defined. When I was in accounting school, businesses deduct the value of their benefits, which includes health, and what non-discriminatory meant at that time was you had to have the same coverage. Like I couldn't cover you for certain illnesses or give you a $10,000 physical every year and not let anybody else have that. So that will be a ruling from the IRS. It was originally scheduled to be made April of 2011, and it's not yet happened.
Most Affordable Care Act regulations are way behind, so Well, I'll ask you about that in a couple of years. See
Yeah.
if-
When we do get around to a pay increase, we have to keep in mind that we have 4 years of teacher hires who all make the same wage. So with a limited amount of a pay increase, I mean, that is important to people and will have to be considered, you know, hopefully we can address that issue somehow. Inflation funding, Prop 301, again, the same funds that bring us the classroom site funds, had a provision in it that requires the state to increase K-12 funding by the lesser each year of 2% for inflation. For the last 2 years, and supposedly for the coming year, they have chosen to interpret that rule differently and have not funded that. Lawsuits were brought, and recently there was a ruling that they were required to interpret that the way the initiative was meant to be. The state's vowed to appeal, and there's not likely to be any impact for the 2014 budget. So that's money that we're not going to get.
Mr. Walmer,
Yes.
did we have a conversation at what time about what that difference is between what they actually funded? Because didn't they fund on the transportation?
Yeah, that's what they've done. There's an or in that language instead of an and, so it says to apply those increases to the base support level or other components of the revenue control limit. There is one component of transportation funding that they chose to fund instead. So we get $1.97 per route mile now instead of $1.91. The thing is, our transportation funding is determined by the greater of that calculation or an old benchmark. The old benchmark is higher, so we've actually got no funding from that whatsoever. And a lot of districts are in that same boat.
Do you have any idea that if in fact they weren't appealing it and they did actually have to do what the courts told them they had to do, what that would mean in terms of increased revenue for the district, or do you have a range?
It'd be 2% of $27 million 3 times added together.
Would that be because they would have to go back and fund it all
No.
those previous years?
The lawsuit did not ask for anything retroactive. And,
That would be a windfall.
Right.
yeah, but what would they do to make it happen? Improving economy, you know, we read the paper every day that things are getting better, so that could make it easier for them to help us out. It will certainly improve classroom site fund revenues. And lastly, the governor's budget, which came out on the 14th. And I just picked some of the things that affected Creighton more directly. So from implementation of the Common Core, the governor proposes some monies for one-time implementation kinds of things, like some professional development, some software and some hardware to make those tests happen and to get teachers up to speed on the whole thing. School Facilities Board, similar to how they did with deficiency corrections many years ago, the governor's proposing to do the same thing with district technology, with the aim towards getting schools to 1 computer to every 5 students and to meet some other guidelines like that. Arizona Education Learning and Accountability System, and I don't know how we're going to pronounce that acronym, but what that refers to is the sort of SACE replacement, or to be able to track student achievement from classroom to classroom. You know, SACE still does not do what it was supposed to do when it was invented more than 10 years ago, I'm not sure. And I know that last year ADE asked for $32 million to get that started, and they were awarded 3. So I don't know if that's going to happen or not either.
I think it's 40 something that Huppenthal asked for this year, and the governor put like 7 or something.
Yeah. And, well, but she put some money in here. So there's $7 million in here is what she's.
Admittedly, if it's only a 10-year-old system, that's probably the newest computer system owned by the state of Arizona. I know some are about 40, so yeah.
The governor's proposing a performance funding mechanism through which the district support would be reduced by about $100,000 each year, cumulative for the next 5 years, and would add in state money as well, and then that would all go into a pot and would be awarded back to districts who, through a formula of improvement and performance, would earn back some chunk. So you could pay in your $100,000 and get back more than that or less than that. And again, one component was your actual letter grade. So if you were an A and you stayed an A, you would get that performance level of funding. But also if you improved from one percentile to another, you would get paid for that as well. So it's presumably fair for those who are already high performing and for those who have a ways to go.
I have 2 questions. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to like because you haven't finished the slide. So.
Well, the last thing I have is school safety. You've heard Pam speak of that, and that's a popular program, so the governor is proposing to put some additional monies into that, but it would be a 1-for-1 match. So the amount of funding she's proposing would equal. You want to go ahead?
Just in case.
Just in case? Okay. So the amount of funding the governor is proposing, if you go back to this year, would be enough to fund all of the applications that were turned down. And that's on a 1-to-1 match basis. So you put in and you get 5 of 9 schools funded. You could fund those other schools by putting forward half the money and drawing from that pot the other half.
But we wouldn't have
That's what the governor's proposing.
But we wouldn't have to put in any additional funding if we didn't want to keep our current SROs.
That's my understanding.
And just in case you might be wondering, we didn't really have any applications that weren't approved. What happened was, well, we had a school that did not have their application approved, but we had another school who took their place. So they did not approve a school where an existing SRO was, but they put in its place. So there might be one school that would fall here. However, it's interesting to note that it costs in excess of $80,000 a year to fund an SRO, and a match would need for us about 40. So that's just something to think about.
So my 2 questions. First of all, whose picture is this? Nobody wanted to say it.
I used that slide several nights ago in another presentation that was less formal. That was the governor character from The Walking Dead.
And I clearly don't watch that.
And he's horribly corrupt and terrible.
And as I put it up on the screen, on the screen, about 3 people out in the crowd began to chuckle.
Okay, I obviously didn't get it. My second question is, as you know, there is a statute in our state that was taken advantage of by one of our neighboring school districts whereby if a school increases its school year to 200 days instead of 180, they get a 5% boost in their, I guess, M&O or state aid, whatever. I think that statute also lists a certain number of hours of instruction that would go along with that. And because we've lengthened our school day instead of our school year, we are almost at, my understanding, the number of instructional hours that would be required to get that 5% bonus. Just ours aren't spread out over as many days. I'm guessing the statute is written in such a way that we probably can't. I haven't read the statute lately. We probably can't get that money, but I'm wondering if there's anything that can be shared publicly about any opportunities that might exist there.
I can provide some legal guidance that we received from the Attorney General's office, and I'll just read it. ARS 15902.04 doesn't contemplate the equivalent language that most of the school finance statutes do. For example, for the definition of fractional and full-time students in 15901 A1 A and B contemplates hours and or the equivalent. And so this person from the Attorney General's office spoke with the Director of School Finance, Lyle Friesen, and School Finance has not allowed a district to increase its base level simply because they increased the instructional hours by 10%. They must also provide instruction for 200 days. I know there's some legislation being introduced to increase that to 8%, but as we were having conversations, and Scott may want to share this, what happens with an additional 5%? Does that cover the additional cost? Do you want to?
I calculated that a year or so ago when that fellow from Balls was here
Yeah.
describing how his program worked. And of course, it gives you some monies to spread among your teachers who are working an extra 20 days. It could not match their daily rate. So it would be a bigger contract at a lower hourly rate or daily rate, so to speak. And it also, that leaves nothing for custodians and bus drivers and all the other folks who would have more days to their contracts. So you'd have to come up with that funding as well. So it's a sort of net loss on one hand, but it's a gross, it does give you some more money to work with.
And Dr. Spiller calculated the difference between the number of hours that students in Balts go to school over 200 days and the number of hours that our students are in school is about 15.
Wow.
15 hours.
So, over
15
the
hours
year.
difference over the year.
And I did meet recently for other reasons for work with the sponsor of that bill to talk about other things. And that did come up. So what the bill does is it increases that bump that you get for having a longer school year from 5% to 8%. And rather than requiring the entire district to extended school year, it would allow us to do that in certain schools and not others if we chose to do that. I know Carl Zaragoza knows that sponsor. I did not talk to him about our issue, and gosh, would you be willing to amend the bill to perhaps say that it's not just, since you're making it more flexible anyway, could we meet that by just having longer hours within the shorter year and get that, some bump too? But maybe Carl will talk to him about.
He had put in, at the last meeting, I believe Carl said he had put in a message to this bill sponsor about that very issue.
Okay, very good.
I've thought about that, and I wonder if there's a concern that a large number of districts would jump on that and it would be a funding issue for the state.
Yeah, and that's definitely an issue. They have no clue how many districts,
Yeah.
even as written, would take advantage of it and what it would cost. So,
Any other questions? That concludes my
and I'm
prepared piece.
sorry I've had too much caffeine this morning, so I didn't mean to monopolize it. The two of you had. It's no different from normal, I know, except that normally it's Carl and I, so this morning we just had me. Anything else, Scott, or?
Oh, yes. On the slide 20, there was one bulleted piece that I don't think you talked about, and that's at 4 teacher experience groups.
Oh, I did address that.
Oh,
That's,
did you? I
yeah.
must have been like lapsing out. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we will now stand in recess according to our agenda, taking a break and come back here at 10:15.